Good morning and good day and good evening to all of you, and welcome to UN Talks and our webinar, Securing Financial Pathways to Agenda 2030 during COVID-19. This is a seminar series co-sponsored by Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and the UNDP Sweden. We have now 10 years left achieving the global goals of Agenda 2030. We were well aware of the challenges related to climate change, to poverty, displacement, armed conflict and violence, all requiring a strong multilateral system. And as if that was not enough, the pandemic struck. 10 months on, we now know that the coronavirus will have an enormous impact on development, and that it's way beyond a strict health issue. Its social, political, and economic impacts are complicated, already hard decisions on development policies, on strategies, and not at least on financing. So governments must understand and balance national needs with the commitments made to Agenda 2030 to prevent development losses and stay on course on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The question is, what will be the impact on multilateral and bilateral action for the SDGs if or when the development financing shrinks? In this webinar, we will use Sweden as an example to get a better understanding on how this question will be tackled. We will learn more about the challenges that the UN system face and the difficult decisions that governments face regarding development financing and allocations in the context of Sweden. And we'll also hear more about how civil society actors understand, adapt, and work to improve the situation. The UN talk is, as mentioned, jointly organized by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and UNDP Sweden to contribute to critical reflection and a deeper understanding of the role and the work of the United Nations. And it aims to contribute to critical reflection, focusing on a Swedish audience. I'm Henrik Hammargren, and I'm here to serve as a moderator of this event. I am also the executive director of the foundation. So just before we start, just a few notes about this forward that we're all learning how to use. We have some ground rules. The webinar will, first of all, be recorded, and it will be broadcasted after the event. We will have a short opening intervention by each of our discussions, and it will be followed by a sort of a discussion among them, and then a question and answer session. In the Q&A, we will select questions both from those submitted in the registration for this event. And we will also have additional questions submitted live via the Q&A function in Zoom. Please note that the chat function has been disabled, and that what you submit with the Q&A function can be seen by the organizers. And I should also say that we probably won't have time to address all the questions we get in, but we will do our best to cover them. So let me now then turn to our three speakers. With us today, we have Jennifer Topping, Executive Coordinator of the United Nations Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office. Jennifer will provide to us a UN development system perspective to the issues. We also have with us Sigrun Ravet, Head of Development Agenda 2030 from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. And Sigrun will give us a national perspective on Swedish development cooperation and multilateral engagement. Åsa Thomasson is the Policy Coordinator from Concord, responsible for development financing. Åsa, you will give us better insights in how Swedish society sort of works on these issues and provide that perspective. But let us all start by actually focusing on the multilateral system itself. And for that, we have Jennifer with us. And I would like to just turn directly to you, Jennifer. And we're very, very glad to have you with us. You're with us from a link from the UN. And the question to you, I guess, to frame, it's sort of how might the bilateral and multilateral flows be respectively impacted in as development financing probably is likely to shrink?
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be there. Let me pause for 1 second, make sure you can see and hear me clearly.
I think it all works well.
Great, thank you. So first of all, a quick word of thanks, but a really, really sincere one to the team at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, Henrik, yourself, and the team at UNDP Sweden for pulling these talks together. They're a fantastic contribution to a very needed space for dialogue on these issues now. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you, and congratulations for this series of talks that you've been hosting now for some time. A few opening comments on this issue, and I'm really, really glad and humbled to come through with some reflections on this issue of financial pathways to Agenda 2030 during COVID. Because as we know from our work that we do in the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office together with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, each year we produce a report on financing the UN development system. And we've recently put out this year's report. But interestingly, the last 2 years of the report had, firstly, last year a subtitle called A Time for Hard Choices. And this year it's a time to walk the talk. And I think those two themes taken together really bring us nicely into the issues around the financing for Agenda 2030 and the SDGs in the context of COVID, because there are some very tough choices, and it is a time for action and to walk the talk. The effects of COVID and the impact of what we've seen in this pandemic on really all walks of life, but especially for the most vulnerable, for women, for minorities, for inequality and people left behind. This has been a huge lesson in humility. And it's taught us that it's really difficult to make predictions. And no one really had this on our agenda of making predictions a year ago. And now we're in a very, very different place. So with that humility in mind, it also applies to the world of development and development finance. So I guess my first opening remark is a word of caution when we speak about forecasts and numbers and financing, because it is very uncharted territory that we're in. What is clear, and that's the basis for this discussion, is that the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs are now more important than ever. And as the Secretary General has said recently, investing in the need for the resources and the investment in job creation, job retention, getting education back on track, business back on track, getting budgets aligned with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement in order to have that path to build forward greener and stronger and better. That's really the framework that we're looking at with the SDGs. So how did we get to this point in the path, and what are we thinking about going forward? Well, as I said, while it's very difficult to look at predictions at this point in time or projections, what we do have from an evidence base to look at, arguably the clearest one as an evidence base to look at for this situation can be drawn from the 2008 financial crisis. And what happened in that time when we had a global widespread impact on the global economy, on vulnerability, contraction on employment, on social services, on developing countries. Hunger increased more than it ever had before, inequalities, and all of that framework and the impact of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis is very much what led us into the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And so that 2030 Agenda gave us a roadmap to deal with the sort of global crisis that drove us into that period. So I think there's something very important to look at from that period, even though what we see now is a somewhat different situation, more severe and impacting in different ways. But what did it show us? What was a severe set of development impacts and contractions, as I was saying before, but also on the financing side, both the quantity and the quality of development funding was significantly impacted by that 2008-2009 financial crisis. And in terms of the multilateral system, it slowed down the growth in investment in the multilateral system, but arguably even more impactful from that crisis on the multilateral system was the way funding and financing started to change in its structure and composition. And that any growth in funding after the financial crisis of 2008-2009 was in the multilateral system was much more tied, much more highly earmarked, much more projectized, and much less investing in systems, institutions, and the global agenda more flexibly. And that structural change, in a way, coming out of crisis is very much what not only led us into the framework of the SDGs, but on a financing side, led us into what has come out more recently in the UN system on a funding compact to try to help restructure to a more SDG friendly and qualitative form the way funding flows to the UN system, less tied, less earmarked, more for institutional outcomes, mandates, human rights, the SDG agenda, and the efficiencies around joint and pooled funding. So as we think about this going forward, this pandemic and how it can impact on development economies and then investment and finance has some similarities in severity and global reach, but also some really kind of different characteristics to bear in mind. It has constrained the movement of goods and people, and at a very local level and in an international sense in an entirely different way than the way the previous financial crisis affected economies and investment. So, and particular sectors much more than others. So that does imply that as we start thinking about investment and financial pathways going forward, that fields like basic services, protection are even more important, but also issues such as investment in internet access and digital technology to be able to both more quickly and more sustainably and in a more green sense find those recovery invest and find those recovery paths forward. So that's something really important to bear in mind. Projections now coming out of OECD is that this crisis could be at least 60% more serious than the 2008 financial crisis, both in terms of GDP impact, but also development finance. At the country level, you have countries, like Ecuador. I just saw a report that UNDP, Financial Sector Hub, and the World Bank together did, looking at projected decline in economic growth. And in that country, it looked like approximately an 11% decline in GDP, but really looking at then what are those pathways forward with the need for a different sort of finance investment and looking at green recovery, digital technology, and other newer pathways out because of the specificity of this crisis. So one final point, because I'm probably over time, but what that means, I think, in terms of pathways for the multilateral system does mean that the type of financing, even as we're more and more constrained, needs to find a structure that most effectively and efficiently supports the highest priority global agenda areas in social sectors, in jobs, in climate and green recovery. Sweden has been out front on many and all of these things, in fact, both in terms of the type of finance that the funding compact and other instruments have put in place, with being a strong partner in the core financing engagements with the multilateral and the UN system, but also in these sorts of flexible, pooled types of funds that we work with in the Multi-Partner Trust Fund office, really focused on issues around livelihoods, jobs, climate, recovery, gender equality, human rights, and many of the other issues at the center of this. So those are some of the key adjustments I think we're going to need to bear in mind as we find these pathways forward. It will be hard choices, but I think on the positive side, the fact that we have the Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals as road signs along that pathway put us in a very, very good position, much better than in 2008 and 2009 to structure that effectively going forward for a better recovery. Thanks very much, Henrik. I'll stop my opening remarks there, and sorry if I was over time.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and you were certainly not over time. And thanks also for reminding us that we actually need to approach this whole issue with a high degree of humility and respect that these forecasts are very uncertain. It's interesting when you refer to the whole financial crisis and what we actually learned back then. Also interesting to reflect over the fact that back then there was a high interaction between states in both sort of regional and multilateral approaches. Whether in this crisis there's a lot more individual perspectives, as we know. You mentioned both sort of the quantity and quality in financing. And you also mentioned, and I think that's a good distinction to make, you also refer to funding and financing. And I just wonder if you could just a little bit explain that to our audience, what the difference is between the funding and financing, and then we'll turn to the rest, to our other speakers in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Henrik, and happy to clarify. So in the overall financing of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, when we use the term financing, we refer to all forms of financing that it's going to take in order to realize those outcomes. So that means domestic financing at country level, public financing of governments, etc., but also the types of partnerships that governments will engage in with private sector, with institutional investment, with leveraging all kinds of financing to realize those outcomes. And at the global level, that's the equivalent. So the wider picture of all forms of finance that come into play really to help realize those outcomes. When we refer to funding, it's much closer to home. So that's really the way that in our case, in the UN system, the way the UN system and development system is funded is the resourcing of the work of the institutions and the UN system, not the resourcing, distinct from the resourcing of the wider agenda through all kinds of different flows.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. And now I'd like to turn to Sigrun Rovit from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Sweden is a long-standing international partner to the UN and other institutions, known actually for providing quite timely and innovative ways of financing. So what will be the response now from the government, and how will sort of even Swedish ODA levels be affected, not only by perhaps COVID, but the shrinking GDP figures, but are there other aspects that we need to know? Before throwing you out there, I don't know, perhaps there are other things you'd like to reflect on, also listening to Jennifer. So please go ahead, Sigrun.
Well, thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Jennifer. And I'm delighted to be here. It's a real honor to be here and to discuss this important but also difficult topic. And when I was preparing for this, I thought that let's just take a step back and think about what the situation is that we are in now with I think this year is the first time that poverty is increasing in the world since 1998, of course, with huge consequences for individuals and also for countries. We also have, just as Jennifer said, rising hunger in the world. And I think that's why we were so delighted when the World Food Programme had got the Nobel Prize on Friday. We also have the warmest decade on record. So we have a climate crisis that's ongoing, also hitting the people already at risk and people living in conflict the most. And then last, of course, but not least, getting back to the economical figures that also Jennifer was talking about, that according to ILO, for the first 3 quarters of this year, there was a 10% decrease in income from work. And of course, this will have huge impact for individuals and for societies, and also for the agenda that we're talking about to finance. So I must confess, I got a bit taken aback when I had this in front of me. So now we really have to discuss and do everything we can to see how can we then finance some of this and contribute the best we can. And I want to emphasize also what Jennifer said. I think we are in a good place because we have Agenda 2030 with a really good road ahead of us. And we also have the Paris Agreement. But then back, Henrik, to your question, what will influence ODA? Or development cooperation, maybe we should say from the Swedish perspective. And I can see that we have kind of 4 key areas. And I think the first one is that in a crisis, it's a big risk that governments and companies and individuals start to look inwards and to prioritize home first. So I think there is a risk that the general support for development cooperation might decrease. I can also see in the Swedish parliament and within political parties, there is a discussion that, at least for me, is a little different than I've seen before. So I think that is something which I want to point out. And I believe that we, governments, civil society, private sector, we have to really work together to prevent this backsliding. And I think the most important thing there is to show results and to show that the funding and the financing actually makes an impact for ordinary people at risk. So that, I think, is the first area. The other one is, like Jennifer pointed out, I mean, the needs are immense. So we have to make sure to use this funding really wisely and to use this pandemic as an opportunity to build back better, but also greener. And we need to keep an eye on the price. We have the Agenda 2030, we have the Paris Agreement, and there is a risk now that countries and individuals say, let's forget about that and just go for short-term investment and gains. So I am afraid that green recovery will be at risk. I can also see that more long-term processes like gender equality and investments in peace building can also be at risk because it's less short-term gains, it's more about structural changes where it can take a generation. So we have to make sure to not go for these short-term gains, but have the long-term with us. I think the third area I would like to mention is the pick and choose mentality. Countries and individuals want to show quick results. I finance this project, this is mine, I can show the results. And I can also, Jennifer, I don't know if you mentioned it, but I saw it in your report that, for example, the funding for the UN is still only 10% that is core. And for Sweden, it has been imperative to have this long-term financing over many years and also with core support. And in a crisis, you can see the pandemic and also the 4 famines that we had a few years ago. It is this flexible core funding that actually can kickstart things and can make the UN and other multilateral organizations to be really relevant. And at the same time now in the crisis, I think there is a big risk that we forget that it's not only about the quantity, it is about this quality of funding. So the way we fund really makes a difference. And I also believe we have to support the multilateral system as a whole. There is also a pick and choose mentality there. You go for a few organizations and then maybe you defund others, such as UN Women or UNFPA that work on more gender related and women's issues that then are more maybe provocative and so on. And then my last point, last but not least, development cooperation was not enough before the pandemic, and it is absolutely not enough now. So we have to work together with investors, private sector, government, civil society, and see how we can leverage the funding we have to be catalytic, and also to use in-country funding, and to really build on this. And to stop on a little more positive notes, my feeling is actually that the business sector is much more engaged in Agenda 2030 now than a few years ago when I was in New York, and I was recently in an event with the Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development. You've seen that the UN Secretary General has now taken this to the global level with the Global Investors for Sustainable Development. So I hope that together we can all do our best and make sure that we actually go forward and not sliding back. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sigrun. Certainly a lot that we will be able to follow up on, issues around prioritization, around the whole concept of Build Back Better. We also have questions already from the audience on these matters. But before going there, I think it's equally important that we recognize the whole role of civil society. Also, you represent Concord. You have over 70 member organizations only in Sweden, but you also have some 23 international networks, I do believe. So there's actually a huge sort of representation that you represent in a way. And I'm very glad to have you here, because the civil society dimension has been sort of recognized increasingly over the years, contributing also in substantial ways to achieving the SDGs. So when you hear these comments, and also sort of when you see the effects of COVID, how does that affect the way civil society works and in the direct relationship at country level and the people you directly engage with?
Yes, well, Concord Sweden is a platform of 76 Swedish organizations as of last week, when a couple more joined. And our members, I mean, we're not one organization. Our members are working on the issues where they're committed, where they're engaged, where they are knowledgeable, together with local partners all over the world. But all through this year, we've been reading reports from members and their partners, and seeing how this pandemic is really affecting every single aspect of people's lives in countries all over the world. And of course, it's also affecting organizations in civil society and the partners that our members work with around the world. So, but above these, I can talk a lot about how it's affecting people, how it's affecting organizations, and I will, but in order to be able to move forward and resolve a lot of the challenges that this pandemic has posed, and the challenges that were already there a long time, we as civil society organizations, I think, need to see and be involved in discussions on a lot of different levels. Beyond that, also a bit more abstract than people or organizations. But just to start with how what we're seeing in reality, I mean, for someone experiencing this in so many parts of the world, it affects every aspect of life: education, your country's health system, your work. So many people were just from one day to the other on the street, especially in the informal sector. Social security, access to food, your farming, if you're a woman, most likely your sexual and reproductive rights, your physical safety, the sheer magnitude of the sort of shadow pandemic of violence against women has just been horrific in many countries and situations. And of course, for the local partners of our members, organizations working to contribute to the sustainable goals for sustainable development in all sectors, all aspects of their work is affected as well. Their whole societies, but also of their organization, of their staff, and especially if you want change to happen, the key issue in many contexts is trying to get people involved and organized and bringing people together to resolve their own problems. And this is what we know working within civil society is the best way to achieve change. And what happens when you can't bring people together? You can't even have meetings. You can't have any kind of physical reunions. I mean, that when trying to organize people is a huge challenge. And I mean, all of these challenges of the practical work of trying to change the whole way you're working with people and communities where you act requires a lot of good donorship, both within civil society and from bilateral and multilateral donors. And it requires a lot of conscious of the situations and the countries where these organizations work, where we've seen a very drastic attack on democracy, which is in line with the trend of closing civic space in many countries. But so many governments has used this pandemic and taking the opportunity to repress independent organizations, human rights defenders in their country. So there's been both violence, even murders. In Colombia, for example, there was horrible examples of using lockdown situations to attack people physically in their homes with impunity. So all of this pandemic is really changing the way that organizations can work. But we also see what the other people have mentioned, the next level, the aid system. And I think there the challenge is, of course, the needs have increased incredibly. How do we set up the aid system for more and better aid? And more is absolutely necessary. And here I don't think that we're seeing enough decisive action. I think from the UN, we are hearing that this is the biggest crisis in our lifetime, of our generation, that this is the time to take decisive action, to really contribute more. But from most donors, we're not hearing the same decisive action. I was quite disappointed with the donors from the OECD countries in the first meeting after COVID-19. The commitment to development cooperation was quite timid. It said, we will strive to protect development cooperation budgets. To me, that's like strive to protect, I presume, from the nationalist trends or the economic trends that Sigrun was mentioning. But isn't that a bit weak in the biggest economic and social crisis in our lifetime? Shouldn't this be the time when all of these packages of trillions of dollars are going out in high income countries? Is this not the time to do something more than just striving a little bit to protect? Like, should there not be investment in development and in order to not lose decades of work? But having said that, we all know that development cooperation won't solve it all. And I hope to come back to some of these issues. But of course, other than more and better aid, as Jennifer was mentioning, we need more and better financing beyond aid. And we need to reverse the current trend where there's actually a net outflow of resources from low-income countries and middle-income countries to high-income countries in debt payments, in tax evasion, tax avoidance of international corporations. These are all things we need to tackle. So not just the aid system, not just financing, but we do need to tackle the financial system that's not taking into account the long-term social, economic, and environmental risks. And that has been a case for some time. And that needs to be addressed, going back to the people from the beginning and what Jennifer was saying, about, and Sigrun as well, about building something better, something greener, something fairer. And that is, of course, our overall relationship with nature and each other, where this has to be the opportunity when we address a lot of longstanding global challenges of climate change, biodiversity, degradation, conflict, inequalities. So going back to the SDGs towards the end as well. It's where it begins and it starts.
Thank you very much also for reminding us and also sending some quite critical reflections, because as you say, we should prepare for a bigger system, there's a more and better aid, as you say, but that is somewhat unlikely. Before we sort of open up a sort of a wider Q&A through both in questions that we have received, it would be interesting also to hear a little bit on reflection on the statements that we've heard. One question that we actually have received, and both you, Sigrun, and also reflected on this, that Sigrun said you need to balance short and long-term gains. You spoke about sort of impact at level. So one question here is, which of the 17 goals have been the most negatively affected by the COVID pandemic, and how? And development actors, are they really adjusting their financing approaches to address this situation? I don't know, Jennifer, if you have anything to contribute with at this stage. I'm sorry to call on you like this, but you might also have other reflections to make on what you've heard from both Sweden and Concord. So over to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So first of all, I think on reflection on the really very good points that both Sigrid and Asha have brought up on, you know, some of these trade-offs that in all the different places that we're sitting are going to be even more difficult, starker trade-offs and tough decisions. Back to that point on hard choices. And, you know, if with the framework of the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, it helps us with the framework for those trade-offs. But even when that was framed, no one was expecting that these were going to be such difficult choices. So I think the points that both Sigrun and Asha made, but maybe Sigrun in particular, and first about this, you know, what do we do about a pick and choose mentality, for example, and what does that do to our overall commitment and framework in development cooperation and in the multilateral system toward Agenda 2030, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, etc. Once we start down, because of tough choices, once we start down the path of picking and choosing, and also a more domestic pressured agenda, how do we rebalance for an outcome, which we're all talking about, which is a better recovery, greener, fairer, etc. There's no easy answer to that, and I kind of fear that, and we don't have the data to answer the question kind of directly on which goal is most impacted by COVID. I think it's too early to have real evidence on that yet, because outcomes and investment haven't really been tracked by goal yet. We should have that soon enough. But I guess at the broader level, one of the most tested goals is really goal 17, because it really is about some of these things that, as Sigrun was outlining, that are under pressure and at threat, about the very nature of multilateral engagement, about not having to, you know, the risk of looking inward and retreating from global commitments. And that goal 17, while it's not as kind of targeted and clear as many of the specific outcome areas in the other 16 goals, it really is an underpinning one. If you don't have that strength of the partnership and the mutually reinforcing commitments, and that's tested because of this, then it has a big impact on the others. So I think we'll definitely be looking at more specific metrics and measuring on what's happening in the different goals and what's happening with overall investment levels and where. But I think keeping a priority on the agenda on goal 17 is kind of the overarching order of business as we get into some of the more specific risk areas.
Sigrid, would you also like to come in on this? Because you actually provided some examples also on gender, for instance, and also, as we see, reduced funding to UN Women, UNFPA, and so on. So please.
No, I was, and I'm sure, Jennifer, you're right that it's too early to say exactly which of all of the goals, but I actually think that the fact that they're so interlinked, you can just take one example, which I just saw the report from the World Bank today on the effects of climate change on poverty, which were actually staggering numbers when they're looking at how climate change also will affect poverty. So there you have the goal 13 affecting goal 1. So I think we can unfortunately be quite sure that the whole agenda will be severely affected. But that one, I think also the maternal health one we've seen, because I mean, it's the secondary effects of the COVID pandemic, not being able to give birth in a hospital or getting vaccination and things like that, where we were actually on a good path. So I would also point out those two. And then to get back to what you said, Åsa, I mean, the whole discussion about democratic space, about attacks on media, journalists, so probably parts of goal 16 also, with peaceful societies, rule of law, and so on. And I think there we will all, this will be something, I think maybe looking back in 5 years or so, we'll see this was a turning point, because how can we make sure that these enforced measures are not just, will just not stay there forever now? So that you so strongly pointed out. So I just wanted to get back to that one.
Yeah.
And I should probably have also clarified goal 17 that we heard earlier is the goal to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So just to clarify that. Åsa, please come in.
I will start by partially agreeing with Jennifer there on goal 17, because it's the goal on working together. How should all the actors be working for sustainable development together? And it's also the goal that has a lot of the financing. And if we compare to earlier development agendas, such as the Millennium Development Goals, if you look at the commitment to support this agenda and the financing that actually went towards it, there wasn't an increase with that political commitment. But unfortunately, the financing aspects of the Agenda 2030 hasn't really had the same push, and not for all the targets, because it's not just about contributing the funds, which hasn't been done. If you look at the global picture, the development cooperation has been sort of reducing slowly for a few years and then sort of flatlining last year. But it's also all these other financial, political reforms to make sure that financing can work for sustainable development are also in goal 17. And it's incredibly important to do that. And also to just say one thing that I hope will be a positive effect on particular SDGs is what Jennifer was mentioning in the beginning about the awareness on effects on sort of a systems institution thinking, the awareness of how devastating the effects have been due to the fact that health systems, education systems, social security systems are not in any way prepared to deal with this, and the horrible effect that that's having on people. Hopefully that will be the goal, that this pandemic helps highlight the need for so much more and more systematic investment.
Thank you very much. And while talking about the systematic investments, I mean, a lot of this relies on a quite old system of ODA, as was referred to, Official Development Assistance, and that is a joint agreement among OECD member states on a certain definition, counted on GDP. But the question is, as we see sort of the economic impact of COVID, that will gradually decrease. And although in Sweden, as in many OECD countries, it hasn't really impacted yet on neither this or even potentially next year's budget. But how much do we actually know about this? Is that something that any of you would like to comment upon? Because as Jennifer, as you also pointed out, it's too early to see some of these trends. But we are aware of the risks. So how can we mitigate some of these risks? I don't know who would like to perhaps tackle that.
Mm-hmm. That's a difficult one. I can just add that fortunately for Sweden, the economy is going quite well. So the gross national income will, as it looks there, I mean, it's predictions, as Jennifer said. I think we will have more or less the same development aid budget when it comes to the 1%. But of course, there are other factors that can influence.
Yeah, it's not. It's not a big decrease. It is a small loss. Fortunately, the economy in Sweden seems to have bounced back better than the government was predicting this spring, mid sort of news of the pandemic. And I hope that was the case for more countries, especially more low-income countries where that isn't the case. But it has sort of affected the aid level, because in the original prognosis, you would have expected a slight growth in the aid budget. So what we have now is that in absolute terms, the level will be more or less the same as last year, whereas it was expected to be a couple of billion Swedish kronor higher next year, and it won't be, but at least it's not going down in absolute terms. Yeah.
Jennifer, may I also turn to you if you would like to come in on this? Right now, I think you're actually muted, but I'm not sure.
Can you hear me now?
We can indeed, thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, along similar lines to what Sigrun and Asha both just said, it's the predictions are difficult, but there was the recent financing for development high-level events that were held in New York. There was some material indicating that there may be up to about an 8% decline in ODA. Again, that has a number of caveats to it, but that figure was presented in one of the reports. What does that mean country by country? That's a function of economic impact in different OECD countries. So as Sigrun was saying, that in Sweden, touch wood, with the economy being fairly stable and relatively strong compared to others, that those levels may be holding, but in others that are more severely impacted, it may not be the case. So there was that report just recently in the Financing for Development indicated something in the ODA realm of a possible 8% decline. But I think, as others have said, what's important in here is the ODA piece is a very important piece of the financing puzzle for SDGs and for recovery and for more than ever in this context. But the other flows and looking at the dynamics of other flows are equally and important to look at. And I think it was also that was saying that, at the country level, we've got on top of that pressure on development assistance and international public finance, debt situations and capital flight and other sorts of things compounding that picture. So I think it's in that recipe that looking for financing and investment partnerships and opportunities and pathways, as we say, that tap into an increased engagement. I think it was Sigrun at the beginning that was saying on the positive and momentum side, we see much more engagement with the private investment finance, the Swedish network for investors in sustainable development. There's global networks of these. There was a forum again last week that was hosted by the Joint SDG Fund that brought together some really, really interesting voices and players in the investment capital world with a commitment around SDG financing targeted on environmental, sustainable, and governance agenda issues. So I think we do have to, as we look at ODA pathways, keep working on that global partnership, because that investment in ODA is an investment in the countries that that we're serving, but also in at home from a global security point of view in these sorts of issues like pandemics that don't see borders, and we're grappling with one now. It may not be the last one. So it is all part of the global interconnected web of investment.
Thank you very much. And let's focus a little bit then on the money we actually know is there. And what you also said, Jennifer, it's not only about the quantity, but the quality of funding. Sigrun, you referred to sort of the pick and choose risk, that there might be changing sort of member states sort of policies around these and their preferred actions and so on. So how do we actually use systems better? I don't know if there's anyone better to speak in terms of sort of the impact and the positive effects by pool funding mechanisms than Jennifer Topping. So I of course would like to hear you, Jennifer, on how can we make better use of the instruments, and do you have any specific sort of recommendations in this? And how does sort of these aid instruments also work in favor of civil society actors?
Yeah. Thanks, Henrik. Yeah, the quality of funding and the structure of funding is a really, really important part of this conversation. And I think one of the most important agreements underpinning the SDG agenda and underpinning the UN's role in supporting that was struck. I referred to it in my opening comments, but everyone might not be familiar. But it was agreed to in 2019, before the onset of the pandemic. And this was a first ever type of agreement on the quality of funding, on the UN's role in supporting the SDG agenda. It was called a funding compact, and it was really underpinning to say, if as a global partnership supporting this agenda, we expect to see a certain role of the UN development system, the specialized, the normative roles, the operational roles on the ground, then what is the not only volume, but the quality of funding that it is going to take to allow the UN to effectively perform that role that's expected of it. And that came about because, as I said, when we did a lot of the analytics on what the funding landscape looked like, we did find that the levels of core flexible funding to support mandates and allow institutions to do what they're expected to do was quite low in the overall mix. As Sigrid said, is about 10% of the overall funding envelope of the UN. Some agencies even less than that, some a little bit more, but overall at 10%, which means that the other 90% is some form of extra budgetary financing. And the vast majority of that takes the form of projects, single donor to a single agency in a country to do a project. And that may be a really important project substantively, but when you take it at a systems level, it means that a huge amount of the resources and energy of the UN system is not working in a way flexibly and toward its mandate. It's a project implementer for many, many thousands of small things. And that takes away a lot from the effectiveness side. So this funding compact really spoke to how do we improve the quality of the funding architecture and structure so that the institutions have a better overall impact on the outcome. So that meant a stronger commitment to core funding, increasing the proportion of core funding that allows organizations and agencies to deliver their mandates. And then on the non-core side of it, a doubling of the proportion of funding that is not single entity projectized, but joint funding platforms that bring agencies and actors together, including civil society and multiple donors, into pooled financing instruments for those common outcomes. So rather than having 15 separate projects to do that with all the different actors, to have a common agenda and platform for that particular area or goal, and one financial instrument that allows for synergies and efficiencies to come together. So we've been working a lot on that. That's a really, really important part of the funding compact. And there's some really interesting innovations in that space that aren't just coalitions of UN agencies, but are bringing in, as I said, civil society, but also private finance, business, philanthropy, and others. One of the more recent ones we just launched was called the Global Fund for Coral Reefs on the blue economy agenda that Sweden has been so active on as well. That really is exactly that, the core UN partners, a group of different member states, but importantly, civil society, specialized organizations, and private investment capital as well into the same platform and financial instrument.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to actually come back to sort of what the progress is towards the targets of the funding compact, which is a really, really central instrument in addressing the challenges as we knew them before COVID. But I'll come back to you. But Sigrid, you also mentioned sort of this, and what you hear now from Jennifer, does that pretty much match the view of Sweden in this case?
Thank you, and I must say, Jennifer, you are the best at explaining this technical issue in a very comprehensive way, because Sweden has been working for many years on, I mean, it is clear that you get the best results from having these more predictable long-term core support, especially in a crisis. So it's so sad that then when the crisis hits, then we all, not maybe all hopefully, but go back and start to, you know, pick and choose. So I think Sweden has tried to be representative of this good donorship and to actually persuade other donors. I think you need to get your political level involved, because political level will be able to explain this in a better way for other colleagues. So I think that's one important point. And then I think the UN really raised to the occasion during the COVID pandemic. I have understood that there has been really strong cooperation, good work on the ground, and I hope that the results also can talk for themselves. So I hope that's something that will be important. And I can just, if I can just quickly compare to the World Bank, where there is much less of this earmarking, and you have everybody, you know, shipping in together, it makes a big difference. And this week now we have the World Bank's yearly autumn meeting, virtual, starting now, and it is clear that the bank has been really in the front lines of doing a lot of support towards the COVID pandemic. But they are also now raising the flag that the demand is so big from not least low and middle income countries that I mean, the funding that they have will also much earlier be finished, and there will probably be, you know, requests for additional funding. And there the question is how, I mean, will the different countries then raise to the occasion and chip in again? I'm not sure with the landscape we have today. So I think this is yeah, also worry in a way.
Thank you very much. And it's important also to recognize that the role of the World Bank and the increased money through that has been made available through the whole development of the way the World Bank raises its money. Now, we have received two questions actually sort of link in to this, and one is related to, you also mentioned results earlier as one of your bullets, and one of them can actually be sort of connected to that, and that's how are the UN and Sweden acting to make sure that their financing gets to the people in the global south. Connected to that is another question on how to localize development financing to make sure that it's available for local development actors. It goes back to what Jennifer said earlier about using sort of specific tools and so on. But How would you like to sort of address these issues? And I think, Åsa, you're well placed to at least reflect on these questions, both what is happening and what should be strengthened.
Absolutely, and I love that question. I was just about to raise my hand and say something about this. I think it's hugely important that when we look at how do we make the most of the resources we have within the system? How do we do this better? I think that it's so hugely important that COVID-19 doesn't become sort of a, okay, now everything is crisis, let's bunch everything together and just get whatever resources out there any which way we can, and not thinking about who does what, etc. I think it's so important that it doesn't stop, but rather looking at ways that how can this help to boost a journey towards more local ownership, because there are commitments and agreements in place. They are even in the Agenda 2030 targets. I mean, we have the grand bargain within the humanitarian work where it's very clear that we need to be working towards more initiative, more power, more involvement of local actors, local organizations who are there, who can and who will try to work in their countries and contexts. And I mean, we also have the whole development effectiveness principles. There are international commitments on how we should be working, and we know what works, and it's incredibly important to not step away from those principles because we are in the middle of a pandemic or we're in these urgencies. And in terms of civil society, and especially supporting, making sure resources reach people, making sure that whatever happens is locally owned, that the initiatives do come from people, because that's the way that change happens every time. I mean, even projects and programs, work that our members do, that the Swedish embassies do, that the UN does. I mean, in the end, it all comes down to people in their local communities having to get together and do things. That's how change happens. So independently which development actor we're talking about, that's who finally does the work and creates the change. And I think in terms of support to civil society, local civil society, and strengthening the abilities to act. I mean, a lot of the principles that Jennifer was mentioning for the UN, we know that's exactly as true for local organizations. There needs to be long-term, not projectized, but rather sort of long-term support for the strategies that organizations that are connected to people at the grassroots level are working on. So I think that it's incredibly important to talk about how do we do that. And just one very sort of concrete risk in that area, because we're part of the European Confederation of Development Organizations. And when analyzing the EU response to COVID, it's a detail, but it's an interesting detail. There, in the previous peer review of EU aid, they received some criticism or some comments on the fact that their work with the UN institutions was sometimes too projectized. And I think that the case here is that the incentives within the regulations of the EU is that it's easier to do the agreement processes, of course, with multilateral organizations. And I think there's a danger there. If you end up doing projects with the UN because it's easy, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. We should be supporting, as Jennifer was saying, the multilateral system and making sure that it's equipped to do what it exists for. And then we should be looking at all these ways to make sure that every development actor is doing what they do best in the way that they do it best, and preferably with some long-term sustainability in the funding.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I will turn back to you, Jennifer, but also because I'd like to also come back a little bit about what you said about the funding compact, and also you mentioned the grand bargain, which is it's a deal with both humanitarian actors and humanitarian donors to increase and make better use of humanitarian action, funding for humanitarian action, which we have actually seen a dramatic increase in over the years. And you can say that that has also had an effect on development financing, if you like. There are other such deals that's been struck. We have the Goal 17, which is an integral part of the SDGs, of course, that's already been referred to. But we also have the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action about financing for the SDGs and so on. So, Jennifer, just a quick sort of update on where do you think we stand on these? And is there actually a risk of renegotiating these frameworks, which is a question that we have also received?
Yeah, I think that the context of COVID definitely puts a lot of things on the table with a different light. I was going to say back on the table, but I think these are already still very much on the table. Things like the funding compact, as you said, is quite recent. And the Addis agenda was framed really to accompany the SDG agreements. So there is an ongoing discussion revisiting that, and that financing for development event that just took place in New York at a very high level last week, the week before, was very much in that light. So it wasn't a renegotiation in a formal intergovernmental sense, but it was definitely a revisiting of the financing framework for the SDGs in light of COVID. So I think that definitely is going to continue to be at the center of the discourse because of the financial impact of this. But I think, excuse me, I think that what's really important is back to your earlier question about at the local level, how do we really ensure that the types of investments and priorities and most severely impacted people are really getting the resources that are there and that are needed most effectively and efficiently. And I think there has been something quite interesting and important in the last, these recent months of the pandemic at the country level. In every country where the UN system works and has a kind of convening and coordinating role with partners, governments and non-governmental organizations. And that is putting in place and supporting the process led by national authorities of socioeconomic impact and response plans across the board. And really looking at country by country at the ground level, where are the most severe impacts? Because there are such big differences. Some countries have a very low actual COVID caseload. So it's very little, for example, as a health sector impact. But the economy is completely wiped out because there's no travel, there's no tourism, there's no local market economies, the financial flows, remittances are way down. So you have a huge development crisis, even though COVID per se hasn't hit. And then you have other countries where when you look at that socioeconomic framework, there's a huge impact on health and education interruption because of the impacts of the virus. And an economy that's, maybe having that impact, but the heavy part of it is on social sectors. And as we were saying, the impact on maternal health and vaccine interruption and all of those sorts of things. So those country by country socioeconomic response plans led by governments and bringing the international community together are a really, really important framework now to be able to help us answer this question about resources and how to get them there efficiently. So what we're doing is linking some of these higher quality, more efficient pooled global instruments like the Joint SDG Fund or the COVID Response and Recovery Fund or the Peace Building Fund because of the dimensions on the impact on social fabric and peace and conflict, to really getting resources that address the priorities in those national response plans. And those national response plans are generating a kind of bankable pipeline at the country level for any source of financing. They're not just for the UN, they're a national portfolio for investment on a priority basis. So I think bottom up, that's a really, really important part of linking the global kind of macro type things that are such important aspects of the system to the reality on the ground at the country level.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And one question we did receive was actually, are there any sort of innovative findings or things that has been tested that we could learn from already at this stage? And I think what you've signaled now, learning from sort of this bottom up, what actually works, what needs to be changed at country level, that's one such thing. And I don't know, Sigrun, do you have other things that Sweden has reflected over in terms of innovation in tackling the crisis already? And it's okay to say no as well. I don't want to put you on the spot, because it's, as we also said, it's perhaps it's too early to actually reflect on some of these things, but anything.
Thank you. That was a good and difficult question, because I haven't mentioned that I've only had this job for 8 weeks. So I'm sure there were loads of innovative things that have happened, but I think mainly it has been to actually maybe front load financing to support, I mean, certain sectors in a different way. There is a lot of talk now about more, you know, going into the social protection, maybe the learning from the Swedish child allowance, those kind of support systems. But I must say I don't know enough about it. I'll have to talk about that next time. But there was one thing I wanted to, if I could just add, because you had somebody who asked about how does Sweden follow the results of the funding and financing to the UN, and I think that's an incredibly important question, and something since for a few years I was posted in New York, we were struggling with a lot and really wanting to make sure that we did this. So I can just mention a few things, and one is that Sweden is on the boards of all of the funds and programs, so we actually see what are the direction of the organization and how do they report back. Also, I mean, sometimes really difficult questions about interventions and so on, and we have a lot of discussions with the different organizations. We also, of course, follow the money. There's a very thorough financial follow-up that is done. We also have a really good network of our embassies, together with our SIDA colleagues, together with Stockholm, and of course then maybe mainly New York, Geneva, of course Brussels also, that with the multilateral institutions, where we also have a discussion on what have we heard in the field. We also talk a lot actually to civil society partners, and sometimes get complaints, and sometimes also praise about different things. And then of course, last but not least, we talk with the countries themselves. I mean, the partner countries, how they perceive the support. So I just wanted to and then I'm sure many more things that on a more technical level that colleagues at SIDA and others could tell me about, but just to mention a few.
Absolutely.
Would you also like to come in there also?
I would, in terms of innovation in financing, I would have to say I'm not quite sure, but I think in order for innovation to be able to happen, it is quite important that the good donorship or the steady sort of and flexible funding is incredibly important, because innovation certainly has happened. I mean, I can't even believe how many organizations, local organizations, in terms of digitalization of whole areas of work that have had to happen over a very short period of time, changes in entire parts of a strategy or entire strategies of work, and definitely new ways of reaching out to really marginalized people that are in for different reasons hard to reach when you don't actually meet anymore in communities. So I mean, it's definitely a ton of innovation going on, but I'm not as knowledgeable about the innovation in the financing itself.
Thanks. And I would just assume, also building on what Jennifer said, it's so important to learn right now from country level about, and that even so for civil society, how to actually participate and engage and take part of some of these instruments that's been established. We're going to turn over to another question that's been raised that was also commented, you included in your opening statement, Sigrid. And that's, the question is literally, one hears a lot about building back better after COVID, but what does this mean in practice? What type of changes to financing are being discussed that could improve development outcome during and after the pandemic? So that is the question, and you actually reflected a little bit about that. How should we understand Build Back Better? It was once introduced as a response to human disasters, actually, or man-made humanitarian disasters. So I'll turn to you first, but also, Jennifer, perhaps I need to sort of involve you also in this.
No, I think that to build back better and hopefully also greener. I think what we're hoping for, and I'm not saying that it will be easy all the time, but to take this crisis and kind of start with to make sure that the investments we do now are, for example, that we don't go back to investing in, oil, gas, fossil fuels, but to build on all the good things that we have when it comes to, for example, a greener investments. But I'm also thinking about gender issues. We can see with the pandemic how it has struck, so especially women and girls, and to in the response that we do to use the best practices and follow the path. I think that is a big thing to say, that let's follow what we had already promised and decided, like you say. We know what gives results. We have already signed up to many important things, such as the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030, and let's stick to it. So in a way, that is probably part of the building back better and greener, to stick to what we have promised and the path that we had, and not take some shortcuts into non-sustainable investments.
Thank you. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add? I know there's been reflections on the whole concept of Build Back Better, so even from the Secretary General. So
yeah, I think there's been a lot of interesting work and reflection on this, and it is, with a terrible situation of this pandemic, this is the main area where an opportunity is in a way happily presented and sadly presented because of the pandemic. Sadly on the pandemic side, but happily because, often we need a very severe shakeup in order to find a really different approach to something that was needed. And when we think about the green economy, sustainability, all of the things that are embedded in the SDG agenda and Agenda 2030, we could raise the question with the Paris Agreement, was there really enough momentum, commitment, kind of firepower in there to drive it forward to the extent that the planet needs? And maybe we were too incremental in our response. We, in a big we sense, the global community. Sweden, thankfully, is one of those that is always at the forefront of pushing change in green investment and in equality and many of the things that underpin it. But taken together, maybe it was a too incremental, too modest, too start and stop approach, and maybe this crisis is what it's going to take to really get a more serious attention to a different path of recovery. So what does that mean? I think that we are seeing indications of the need for kind of green investment in infrastructure, climate resistant infrastructure, finance, which is more digital, more of our development processes that are underpinned by fintech and financial technologies, social protection systems that are embedded with cash transfer systems, et cetera, that we've seen that can get resources to people's hands in a mobile world really efficiently. But it does mean there has to be a digital infrastructure to underpin that. And that's growing, but it needs to grow even faster. But I think this crisis really does give us, in a much clearer focus, the clarity of the picture that we really need to place that now on a much higher level of priority in order to not have the backsliding for so many people around the world.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We speak a lot about the crisis, and of course we refer to the pandemic, but we should also recognize that perhaps we're facing two other crisis. For the one and the biggest is of course climate change, but there's also the issue raised by another participant, and that's related to sort of the crisis in democratic development or democratic space. So the question is, how could Sweden's international development cooperation help respond to the growing threat of shrinking democratic space and the rise of authoritarian regimes in its partner countries? Now, this is a very complex issue, and we could add to that sort of also the shrinking space for certain development actors, be it civil society and so on. Anyone who would like to sort of take this on?
Love to talk.
Also, we'll start with you. And we have now approximately 5 minutes left, and we'll do a little bit of a wrap up also. So, but also I will start with you. Thanks.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot that we can do, but it is a very dire, serious situation. We're up to the 14th year running where democracy is going backwards worldwide, well, in more countries than where we see progress. And this is something where people who are just trying to exercise their basic human rights and live a life in their communities, in their countries, are being faced with extreme restrictions of the right to free speech, of the right to free assembly, of the freedom of association, etc. So there has been a real rise that is particularly affecting civil society organizations, where independent, free organizations, something that we know is incredibly important for the rights of people and change, social change, democratic change to actually happen in the lives of people, are being attacked just for that. And I think that there's a lot that you can do. It can feel very depressing and worrisome. I'm the first to say that I am depressed, and you have to be very cautious. Transparency, accountability, and all kinds of cooperation with governments where you see things going the wrong way is incredibly important. It's also important to be smart, to look at what could potentially work when you're working in a country. Who is there that can affect change? Who is there that is actually involving groups that don't have a voice or that are being attacked particularly harshly? Like, where are the opportunities to support? And that the answer to that is different, I think, for every country. There are no easy answers saying you should always do this, or you should always, like, you should never work with government, or you should never work with this type of civil society organization. There are no easy answer. The answer is different for every single country. But what you do need is a lot of political awareness, a lot of understanding of what goes on in all democratic spaces. So the role of Swedish embassies in this case, if we're talking about Sweden's development cooperation, is incredibly crucial, both in terms of giving the right financial support, but also the right political support to people and organizations under threat.
Thank you very much. Sigrun, if you like.
Absolutely. No, I can just add, and thank you for those really wise words, that democracy has been one of the core areas of development cooperation for Sweden for many, many years, which I think we can actually be proud of. And then we see an even bigger backlash now, but it's something that has been there for many years. And I think there are both, like you say, it's the political support, it's the dialogue with the countries, but also to support organizations that are working with, like you say, journalism and media issues and so on, and not least working through civil society, I think, quite often within these circumstances. But I would also say that, I mean, Sweden was really pushing to have a goal within the Agenda 2030, which is goal 16 on peaceful societies, where you can say that you have the rule of law and the more democratic part, which is part of it. And it was a real battle to get it into the agenda, but at least now we have something. It could be even clearer. I'm the first one to admit that, but it is something there. So I think there is quite a long tradition to be working with these areas, and now we just have to think even better how we can do this in maybe a more systematic way with a big pushback that we see.
Thank you very much, and we have actually come to sort of the end of some of the questions that I've tried to bring into this discussion, and I will still like you to perhaps reflect a little bit. And I'm actually like to come back to Jennifer's issue here on the quantity and the quality of financing. I think regardless on how we look at the situation, we have concluded that the needs are almost beyond our imagination, the way they have developed and how quickly and dramatically this has changed. So when we now focus both on maintaining sort of levels of international development cooperation, how can we ensure that we also focus on even taking further the quality of how funding is provided? So if you can ask perhaps with your own reflection a little bit about what you've heard here today and on this issue, if you like, we will then sort of wrap up and close the meeting. I don't know, Jennifer, if I might actually turn to you first.
Thanks, Henrik. Yeah, that's a really important wrap-up question. So I think on the quality of funding and financing, I think for Sweden especially, in a way, it's what I would say it's a stay the course message, in the sense that the multilateral system has been able to always count on Sweden for putting high priority on that kind of flexible and unearmarked core and the type of funding that allows the UN to deliver on what's expected of it in the multilateral system. And when times get tough and pressure is on, resisting that risk of looking inward, retreating, and becoming more projectized, etc. For Sweden, I think because of a strong position on the quality side, it's perhaps less at risk, but maybe asking also Sweden to keep its networks and relationships going with other funding partners in the spirit of that compact and in many of those reform movements that you've had a leadership role on, is to help us keep everyone at the table on that agenda, because that is a really real risk. And then I would say in the second point, specific to this situation and this pandemic, with a continued eye on what are we going to need to do differently in order to have the sustainable and green outcomes. So really keeping an eye on, within the quality agenda, how do we focus it so that that transformation is inclusive, so that it's green and sustainable, and looking at closely at keeping that innovation dimension at the center of what and how we're investing. Thank you.
Thank you. Åsa?
Well, I think that what is really needed, and maybe going back a little bit to the concept of building back better, or at least building better, greener, fairer societies, I think that a lot is needed. I mean, development cooperation has a lot of homeworks to do. We have a lot of things where we need to get a lot better in really making sure that we work in a way that we are committed to do in the Agenda 2030 and other very important commitments to how we can make the aid system itself fairer and more adapted to the change that people want to make happen and are working to happen. But the other part, and I think the most important part during COVID-19 that I would like to say both to the Swedish government and to every other government, is that to try to do our best to not turn this into a major political crisis or a lack of political action, because we already know it's the most severe social and economic crisis, health crisis affecting all societies. But what needs to happen is that political reform on all of these areas that are so crucial to financing a more sustainable development is so needed. And as Sigrun was saying at the beginning, what we're seeing instead is countries turning inwards and sort of looking at, okay, how can we support our economy, instead of seeing that we have Agenda 2030, we have the Paris Agreement, we have the international human rights, we have all of these international commitments pointing us in a direction as a planet. So I really feel like to do everyone's utmost not to turn the legacy of COVID-19 into this experience of political inaction and not doing what was needed, both to support people in developing countries, but certainly also to reform the financial system and everything that is not working at the moment, and that's keeping so many countries in debt, and which is basically making the international system leak like a broken bucket, because there's so much financing out there that is not doing its job of contributing to a sustainable development. So those aspects, like tax avoidance and tax evasion, the lack of a decent multilateral debt resolution mechanism, and all of these things that need political bravery, political action to construct new things in the multilateral system. That is something which I would really like to send as a message to the government, to not leave it at that the system is constrained by the lack of finance, but where is the political initiative to create it.
Thank you. Very important reminders. Some last words, Sigrun, before we close.
Thank you. No, I think reminders like the report from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation about how important the funding is and which results you can actually gain by just the way you finance. I think that is one important part. I want to again reiterate the results on the ground to actually be able to show that, and not only Sweden saying that, but the countries themselves and the individuals. I think also that we as Sweden will continue to reach out to others and try to be a good donor. But then in the end, to maybe also really acknowledge that, I mean, development cooperation is not the answer to everything. So also maybe in discussions like this, we would need to have the private sector already here and to kind of be more inclusive and broaden this discussion to other stakeholders. And I think we can do more there.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And so it's my pleasure on behalf of sort of the organizers, both from our side, but also UNDP, to thank you, speakers, Åsa, Sigrun, Jennifer. It was I'm very glad to have, you took the time to be with us. To all of you who have participated, I would also like to thank you, and also, you know, just to draw your attention to that there is, if you look in the chat box, you will see a link to a feedback survey. So before you log off, it would be very useful for us to get some feedback on this. And also you will find links to the publications that's been mentioned here. We will share that. And as with all work, you know, it's easy for me to just stand here, but it wouldn't happen without the teamwork. So I really like to thank sort of the team from UNDP, especially Marika Samuelsson, and from our side, Kate Sullivan, who made this whole thing possible. I think it's very worthwhile, since we're in the Nobel Week in Sweden, to also just remind ourselves that given sort of the World Food Programme, the recognition of the the Nobel Prize, is a very good reminder of the usefulness of the UN system as such, and the need for multilateral action. So for me at least, that was a extremely good sort of award that was shared with the UN system. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at UN Talks. Until then, over and out.
Thank you.